Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would break down for you guys some stuff that Greg Nuckols wrote about. And for those unaware of who he is, Greg is a drug-tested, pretty much world-level power lifter. He's broken some American records and things like that. He's also working on his PhD in exercise science right now, and he has a blog called Science and Strength. So I'll probably link his article down below. This is one he did a few years ago, and it was looking at a lot of the research. And, this is something that comes up whenever we link research or we talk about the fact that, number one, size does equal strength in drug-free lifters. And he's been one of the people who worked with everyone from Brett Contreras to Dr. Brad Schoenfeld on some of their research together, actually confirming that they could actually estimate based on DEXA scans and a person's height, they could estimate within 5 to 10% their max squat every single time, right? And this has been done repeatedly, and it actually does show that there is an enormous correlation between size and strength, that you cannot separate them other than things like a little bit of leverage is height, things like that. For more advanced lifters, the longer you've been training, the less and less you can separate them. The biggest exception to the rule seems to be when anabolics come into the mix. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, there are a lot of guys who use a lot of gear who are extremely strong, brutally strong, and that's true. But what he's going to break down, and if you look at some of the studies that he's looked at and the different stuff that we've observed, it explains why we see big bodybuilders who aren't as strong as you would expect. That's exactly why it is, or why you see the really jacked guy who maybe his upper body's pretty strong, but all his other lifts aren't that good. Maybe his pressing is good. He can bench a lot, but maybe he really sucks at everything from rows, deadlifts, to bench press, to everything else, right? The guy is generally weak, at least relative to his size, not compared to someone who doesn't train, but compared to someone who actually is a strength athlete. But when you look at real naturals, every single jacked natural is brutally strong. No exceptions. No exceptions, right? It almost seems like the baseline for entry to look really jacked top to bottom as a natural is like at least a 315 bench, 500 squat, 600 deadlift. And look at my bro, Nico Ella. Perfect example. So when you start looking at the data that's there, we'll go to the dose-dependent stuff in a minute, but when you first look at some of the stuff that's put out there, there has been some studies done to where they looked at strength of people who were clean, who trained for strength, versus people who were lifters, and it's bodybuilders and everyone else who admitted to years of anabolic abuse. And they did a big breakdown looking at their strength, muscle cross-sectional area, all sorts of stuff. And what's interesting and what they found is that people who abused gear, used very large amounts, did not have strength that was proportionate to their muscle size compared to lifetime clean people. Now, some of them were stronger. In other words, there's some really jacked bodybuilders who are pretty strong. I mean, you go back and look at some of these IFBB pros, and there are plenty of them who are squatting 500 pounds, deadlifting 600 pounds, can bench 400. But if you were to compare their strength versus weight classes, they wouldn't be able to compete at the world level in a strength sport, right? Any strength sport, really. And so you've got to look at that and go, well, that's interesting. So why is that? It must be because they don't train for strength. Well, that's not true, because you can't separate that. You really can't. Because we go back and look at the other research, and we find that when drugs aren't in the mix, size and strength aren't really separatable. There's only like 1 degree of separation there, all right? Like 90% of your strength on your big exercises is determined by how big all the muscles are involved. And that's why something like the squat, which is a relatively long range of motion exercise, the deadlifts can be a little bit different, that uses over 50% of the muscles in the body. So therefore, you can see why it would be a proxy for overall muscle mass, because it uses all the biggest muscles. It's not your biceps and pecs, right? It uses most of the muscles in your body, all the big ones, your back, everything in your legs, your glutes. But when you look at this, they're weaker. Their muscle is weaker per unit. So That's always interesting when you see that. Now, it's been speculated that it has to do with the fact that maybe the drugs don't grow connective tissue as fast, so your body won't necessarily improve neuromuscular efficiency and contractile efficiency and all these other things to go with the size, right? That's one theory, so it'll be disproportionate. The other theory, and this is probably a combination of them, this is stuff Greg has addressed, is that because you are not actually training to stimulate the growth, it also doesn't train the movement patterns and the neuromuscular efficiency and everything else to go with the contractile proteins. But if you were to take some of these ultra jacked bodybuilders and have them go train to get really strong after they've built a base, they usually can. They can usually be insanely strong, right? With the muscle they've already built, but they're also more prone to injuries, which is again another problem if the drugs are creating thicker contractile proteins without corresponding tendon strength and connective tissue strength and everything else, they are more prone to injuries. So when you go look at the other studies, this is where it gets interesting. When you look at the different studies, and he pulled one from the 90s, there have been other ones that have looked at this later, to where they just had people be sedentary. What you find is that even with the sedentary people, he noted something, that some of these studies where the people were kept sedentary and they were given either 300 milligrams a test or 600 milligrams. Now keep in mind, this is not always your black market stuff. This was done in America using American grade, pharmaceutical grade stuff, right? Because this is laboratory conditions. They all gained muscle and they all gained strength. Now, you know, a lot of these studies are what we've looked at, and this is where the lifters get pissed. The drug guys will stand there and they'll get mad and say, there's no way that 600 milligram of testosterone group gained 18 pounds of muscle without lifting while sitting around. Well, they did. And these were confirmed with DEXA scans. All right? They were confirmed with DEXA scans. But the 300 groups usually gain something like 12 pounds on average. What he noted was that the strength gains were pretty similar. In other words, if you gain 5 pounds of total muscle in your body, or 6 pounds, because that was like the difference between the two groups, right? 5 or 6 pounds of muscle gain for a lot of you guys is especially like even intermediates, that's 6 months of hard ass lifting. That is 6 months of blood, sweat, and tears once you're out of the novice phase. Sometimes a year of blood, sweat, and tears. How many of you guys out there would put 50 pounds on your squat and 30 or 40 pounds on your bench press? And I don't even mean your max, even your work sets, right? How many of you guys, if you gained 5 pounds of muscle, would go from squatting 315 for your work sets up to about 365 for the same number of reps? Most of you would. 5 pounds of muscle is a lot. They gained similar amounts of strength. In other words, there wasn't this big difference. And like a leg press, they look at leg press strength, which has less neural efficiency, less technique involved. And in my experience, I mean, a 5 pound gain in muscle is usually worth like 200 pounds on the leg press. If you actually train the leg press, by the way, any of you guys who think 1,000 pound leg press is strong for a man, it's not. That's actually what I expect of a 120 pound woman who trains the leg press, by the way. So and I've seen plenty of 120 pound, 125 pound females at serious gyms rep out 1,000 pounds on a leg press. So just throwing that out there. So when I say that I used to do 2,000 pound leg presses for work sets, when I messed with the lift back in the day, that's not like that impressive, to be honest, right? Considering that I was a power lifter during all those time and on gear, that's not actually impressive. It isn't. That's only twice the strength of a woman. So, little side note there. Leg press strength should be enormous. Like if you gain a pound of muscle on the leg press, you should be adding 40, 50 pounds to it. So, they didn't gain more strength. So what does that tell you? Now keep in mind, they gained like 50% more muscle than the lower dose group. So if doubling the dose, going from 300 is only about double the normal range, right? It's high, that's super physiological, but that's considered extremely conservative. I mean, keep in mind, Rich Piana was using 4,500 milligrams during his death cycle. Jerry Ward's used 2,000 milligrams while on YouTube, right? These are admitted. We've got evidence of all this stuff. So thousands and thousands are normal over in the bodybuilding world, which would explain why some of them are so weak relative to their size. With 300 milligrams, they gained really good strength to go with the size, right? But when they went to 600, they gained 50% more size, 50% more muscle per month. They ended up with like 18 pounds usually versus 12 pounds over the period of time, which I think a lot of the 20-week studies, that's what they've averaged, but with the same strength gains. So you extrapolate that over time. What does that mean? Well, that would mean that anyone who's using those, you could probably carry that out even further. So basically anyone using over 300 milligrams is probably gaining size at a higher rate than they're gaining strength. So you see that, and then people wonder, why are there so many jacked guys who aren't as strong as you would expect, right? Well, there's your answer. Because they're using abuse amounts of anabolics. That's how you pull that off. So when you see a guy who the amount of muscle weight that he carries, the amount of muscle mass that he carries isn't proportionate to his strength, that's indicative of something, especially if he doesn't ever really train heavy and he's really jacked. That's what's going on. And this isn't something that we need to debate. The evidence is there. We've got studies that have both looked at over time, meaning we have studies that have actually looked at the actual strength gains versus muscle gains in people on different amounts, and it is disproportionate that the higher the dose goes, the more muscle you gain without additional strength beyond that certain threshold, right? Up to a certain point, it improves strength with it very much. After that, it stops adding strength, it just adds size. Then we have studies looking at people who have trained hard for years, and what do we find? Guys who haven't abused gear have more strength per unit of muscle. And this is pretty big studies have looked at this. And then you go back and you look at the big studies that have been done on muscle mass versus strength and found an enormous correlation, like a 90% overlap. The only real differences being leverages, meaning the size of your frame, your height. Lever lengths, that's been the only thing that changes it in drug-free lifters. And that's been noted, and research has looked at that closely. The amount of muscle you have relative to your height will pretty much tell you how much a lifter's powerlifting total is going to be. Formulas have been calculated based upon it if they're not on drugs. Or they don't use much, right? They use very small amounts. So this is very, very good scientific evidence. I mean, this is evidence that is about as good as you're going to get for now, explaining this. This absolutely explains why size does equal strength, and why, when it's disproportionate, it's a very, very good indicator that a person abuses anabolics. That they've used drugs, not training per se, to build that size. Right? All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.